3 white butterflies flutter, then land on the artichoke spikes in the walled garden. White sky against the ash, the wind in the leaves a rush of sighs. White lavender at the edge of the pool, white hydrangeas wilted in the bouquet, white lilies sticky with scent, white tissues in the box, white linen on the bed, white curtains shrunk in the wash, white muslin squares, your tiny white vests unworn.
This is Writer's Mosaic in Conversation. Founding editor Gabriel Gbadamosi talks to poet and novelist McCarthy Woolf about London, the Thames, nature and music.
McCarthy Woolf, thank you for speaking with me, Writer's Mosaic. Well, I'm not Writer's Mosaic, I'm Gabriel Gbadamosi, but we're recording this for Writer's Mosaic in your marvellous apartment overlooking the Thames at Greenwich. And I think perhaps we can hear the sounds of the boats going by, the wash on the foreshore, the occasional voice and footfall, but let's just let that happen. What is it that has brought you, a poet, to live in such an extraordinary place where we see a Mississippi paddle steamer go by of an afternoon? Is this the kind of poet you are?
Well, I would think that I'm not. I probably would think of myself as somebody much, much, much less classically, even stereotypically romantic. But I must say that when I walked in here and I looked out of that window and I just was absolutely bowled over. There is something about, I love the Thames. I grew up in London. My dad came to the UK from Jamaica. My mum grew up in London. Her parents were Cockneys, very much, sort of Londoners, etc., etc. And so I just thought, if I'm going to actually carry on living in this city, I sort of want to be at its epicenter. And although we might think of that as not quite a sort of, along the river as you start going out to sea, there's something about the Thames, that body of water. It is actually the line that divides but also brings together north and south.
The other thing that the river does is that it flows out to sea and becomes a connection, a local connection to a really global experience, which is something that's marked your work. You seem to have an extraordinary engagement with nature in a very local way, but then that fans out to ecological, environmental kind of patterns of thinking and of experience kind of globally. And that's a thread I'd like to trace with you in this conversation, if that's possible.
Absolutely, yeah.
But what I'd like to do to begin is to give the listeners an idea of the kind of poetry that you're writing. Would you perhaps start with reading us this poem from your first collection, An Aviary of Small Birds? The poem is called
White Butterflies. 3 white butterflies flutter, then land on the artichoke spikes in the walled garden. White sky against the ash, the wind in the leaves a rush of sighs. White lavender at the edge of the pool, white hydrangeas wilted in the bouquet, white lilies sticky with scent, white tissues in the box, white linen on the bed, white curtains shrunk in the wash, white muslin squares, your tiny white vests unworn.
Thank you for reading that poem. Of course, An Aviary of Small Birds is a collection, and many of the poems within it deal with your experience of the loss of your son, Otto, in childbirth. And that's something that will mark anyone's life. It has deeply marked yours. But let's look at this poem in a certain kind of way. It opens almost as a Japanese or Chinese description of chrysanthemums in the West Garden. It starts somehow in translation in the Far East. And then increasingly it comes down to this experience, as though within the poem you've started trying to be as far from this experience of pain as you can be, that you were pulled ineluctably by that train of thought around whiteness to that small, unworn piece of clothing. Can you say something about the way poetry has given you roots out of, but back into, your own experience?
I think when I wrote that collection, I mean, it's interesting, that particular poem, because that was one of the very first poems that I wrote. I read it at Otto's funeral. So it's that sort of very much at the sort of heart of things. And what I found was when I wrote An Aviary of Small Birds, it was my first collection, and I had another whole manuscript. I was pregnant. I was worrying about how I was going to continue to be a mum. Continue to be a writer when I was a mum. So I would probably have continued to be a mum had it, continued. Anyway, those were my concerns. But then things didn't go as expected. And suddenly my whole world was turned upside down. And it was at this moment that I knew that I was going to commit to my poetry 1,001%. And there was something very particular that I was aiming for in that collection. I really had Otto, I had his spirit in mind, and I wanted to reach towards it. And so for me, because he was a baby, because there's this sort of purity in this baby that has never got to experience the world, there's something about the high notes of that white, I sound, the high note that I was sort of reaching towards and wanted to connect to quite profoundly. And I think what I do in An Aviary of Small Birds, it's interesting that you talk about nature in that space, Gabriel, because I think when you feel like you've lost everything and it's very unexpected, you cling on to the things that you think are certainties. So I look out of the window now and I think, oh, there's the river, tide's coming in, that's a certainty. There's the sky, patches of blue, that's a certainty. All of the horizon, all of these things feel like things that can't change. But we know now that so many things that we've taken for granted in nature actually are no longer certainties. They're very uncertain.
You can hear the continuity of nature in the birdsong, An Aviary of Small Birds. And perhaps listeners now can hear certain notes in the river, in the world. So what I'm reading is a sense of you angling through poetry to what is it that continues and what is it that echoes the experience, his experience, your experience of that traumatic moment, and that somehow continues, and how can we deal with the backwash of that? The whole collection is also a kind of tonal journey of feeling the different experiences and feelings you have through those experiences of being in a coroner's office or whatever's going on in the aftermath. But there's a particular poem that really sort of jumped out at me in the collection, and it appears to be dealing with clowning. It's a poem called Blue, and very interestingly, it has an epigraph from a First Nations North American speaker carrier of knowledge called Lame Deer. Let me read it to you. The clown has a power that comes from the thunder beings, not from the animals or the earth. Being a clown gives you honour, but also shame. It brings you power, but you have to pay for it. There is something about your relationship to nature which begins to me to speak of, well, first of all, this is a First Nations person, a completely different continent, but in some relationship to the land, to culture, to history, to people. But they bring in a spiritual relationship to thunder beings, for example, and offers a calculus about what power this gives you to be in a certain communion with thunder beings, but also the cost of that. In the tonal journey of your poetry, have you been aware of what it has cost you, as well as what it's brought you? It's brought you a fantastic set of accolades as an artist, but as a person, somehow you're paying some sort of cost spiritually. Can you speak to us about the thunder beings of your experience?
I feel like there's something in being cut down to nothing. I felt in the aftermath of that experience, I often think about it, I wonder, was I cut down like a thistle? You could cut it down with a scythe, but it's going to grow back. But I almost felt like I'd been uprooted. It's kind of like I couldn't quite work out which it was, but there was something very profound about feeling as if I had disappeared. I felt like I had disappeared in the world at that time, but there was also something very liberating about not having the persona of me, of my character, of my personality, of everything that I had been. It's quite a strange thing to describe, but it's almost like, I went through that death as well, and then there's a rebirth. So it's phoenix-like. And that with me, what I bring up with that fire, that idea that fire cleanses, think of Kali, think of to destroy, to create, all of those elements, and that it, you come through as somebody else. And that, I think, is part of the transformative power of poetry when we fully enter into the space. And I feel like that is part of the journey that I went on. I mean, it's interesting because there were a lot of birds in that book. And if we think of the symbol of the bird being able to take flight, and so many cultures, that the bird is emblematic of the soul, the ascension, all of those things. But that idea of price, I do sometimes wonder, there was I wondering, what's it going to be like writing as a mum and all those things. And I didn't have that. And then all I had to give, of this great love was in the book. And so, it's funny, Gabriel, because sometimes people go, oh yeah, publishing a book, it's like having a baby. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's not like that at all. Very different.
Here, that experience of being uprooted, effectively of your own death or disappearance, and then a strange rebirth, which you're describing, was something that struck me reading your work. I thought, this is not the kind of construction of a voice, of an identity, of a poet that I'm kind of used to tracking in a poet's work. You seem to have come back in other more interestingly elemental ways, much more elusive than, as it were, constructing a poetic persona. And in your second collection, Seasonal Disturbances, which came out 3 years later, you have described it as a kind of an interrupted zuihitsu. So I noticed that, and I tracked that down. What's that mean? And here's what I could pick up. It's a Japanese concept in origin, in which the text can drift like a cloud. And it describes the running brush. Imagine the calligraphic brushes, a running brush that moves with the wind. And it brings together associative, intuitive elements of thought and feeling. The only thing that structures it is that it is alive, but not anchored. It reminded me very much of the thunder beings, somehow, a kind of spiritual sort of presence in your work that runs through it. Now, let me come to what many people will be very attracted to in your work, which is your focus on ecology, on nature, not as a romantic nature poet with their feet rooted in the muddy soil, but somehow a poet who touches on and explores ways of being in that nature. You've written about, and I made a note of it here, I'm just going to find it, about being at the centre of the edge. And what you're looking for in ecological poetry is something like a sacred hybrid. That sounds very abstract when you come at it, first of all, directly. But listening to what you're saying now, about having, through a certain experience, kind of disappeared and needing to find another way of being in and around and with the world, you're describing a kind of space progressively. Let's call it now the sacred hybrid. Could you talk to us? You and I are both culturally and ethnically hybrid, but can you talk to me now about the kind of sacred hybrid that you're moving through?
Thinking about it in terms of place, I mean, I'm looking out the window and I look at the Thames and I think about, in terms of this body of water, this running brush. And I actually wrote the Zuihitsu in Seasonal Disturbances conversation with water, and I wrote part of it on a boat in the middle of the Thames. And being physically in that space, I was actually, it was an old fuel barge, and it was moored sort of in between sort of the Houses of Parliament and St Thomas's Hospital, which is actually where Otto was born. And I'm on this boat, and I became so fascinated about this experience of being held in the water. So this idea of almost going back to the womb, of being in the water. But culturally, I was also thinking, I'm in this space where I'm neither north nor south. The river is neither north nor south. It is the river. And
for people who don't know, there is a big divide in London. You're either a South Londoner like me, or you're a North Londoner.
Well, I was born north, but I've lived south for quite a long time. And so, but I also think, and it's been something that's interested me over the years, Gabriel, and that is this sort of idea of, from which space do we write from? And I've not really, in my work, not in my poetry, I've not been so interested in perhaps speaking to matters of identity thematically via the content of the work. But what I realised is that structurally, I'm always attempting to somehow create what I consider to be a whole from what is considered but is probably not two dichotomous parts, And so it's about this fusion of opposites. And I'm often thinking about that. And I sometimes think, is that because my dad was a Jamaican who came to London as part of the Windrush generation, and my mum was this, innocent young beatnik who went off to the jazz clubs. They met in the 100 Club, actually, on Oxford Street. It's kind of like a classic. I love it, really. Kind of classic little romance in that way.
Absolutely.
But, and I feel that London is very, very emblematic to that. So, the identity of a Londoner is always going to be of multiplicities. And so I feel, I don't know if that answers that in some way, but
It does very often. I mean,
yeah.
one of the things about your formerly really inventive and probing work is the ways that it escapes some of those absolutely pointless and barbaric binaries of race and the fixities of identity, and says, no, there are different ways to conceive of ourselves and the world, and things do need to change. Let me draw your attention to one of your poems, which is not exactly a poem, it's what you call a photo-lyric, Field Notes from the 21st Century. It's got fantastic lines in it. I've got some of them down here, slightly kind of contracted. You speak of birdsong, identified on an app, obsolete. You speak of a GPS dog collar, so no dog might ever get lost or flee or dodge. We're all dodgers. We're all fleeing the kinds of imposition that were placed on us. But somehow you're paying attention outside and beyond the limits set for us to the river, to the city, to elements of life, and finding new spaces for them to occupy. I mean, the title of the poem, Field Notes from the 21st Century, the 21st century fixes it into a now that can go on for another sort of 75 years or so, but also the idea of field notes that says, yeah, we're really studying from the ground up the anthropology of this, the sort of the flora and fauna of this. You're busting through many of the constraints that we immediately come up against as global majority writers of colour in effectively what has been a white society with a white view of the world. And you're doing it from the very DNA of the ways that you think of poetry. Where are you on that journey?
I think the estuary might be round the next bend, but maybe it's the bend after. You know, when you go on those walks and you sort of go, oh yes, look at that bay at the end, it's not very far. Oh, I'm just going to swim out to the island. Not so far at all. So I'm about that far. I mean, it's interesting because at the moment we live in a world, if you think about it, where it doesn't take us, 2 years to get to Australia. It takes 24 hours. Still quite long, but, I don't think it took 2 years, but you know what I mean. It probably took 9 months to sail to Australia, a very long time. I mean, we've had that opportunity to travel, to experience other cultures. And I think that, it's interesting in a way because you can be very, very local. You can be hyper-localized. And, the more you focus in that hyper-localized way, it becomes bigger and bigger, actually. The smaller you go and the more pinpointed you are, the bigger it gets in lots of ways in terms of what you see in terms of nature. I was thinking of it in a sort of like microscopic way. But equally, I think we've entered this period that is very globalized, where, things are connected and they move fast. It's interesting because, the nature poem is a different thing to what it used to be. Juliana Spar said, we don't just write the bird, we also write the bulldozer on which it perches. I think that is probably what everybody who focuses in some way or immerses themselves in the experience of nature, that's what we're doing. All of my research is very immersive. I like to do very physical things, like go out onto the river and lie on a boat and write about that and become fascinated by this idea, because I do feel that physically being on that water and not being on land, it shakes something else out of you. It shakes an honesty and emotional truth from us that we're very busy constructing little citadels around.
Your movement took you as a Fulbright scholar to Los Angeles. And there your focus was, first of all, some sort of research structure to do with the law, but from the law with human rights with land rights. land rights with, as it were, poetry, which is how did First Nations in the northern areas of America use language, use poetry to describe land and an affiliation with land. And so somehow that poetry has to be a kind of an acid bath for the ways that we construct law and think about law. So let me take you back to something you say about growing up in your household. Jamaican father, English mum really sort of getting you to identify the weeds that grow in the city. But you say, in terms of religion, music is what was God for us. Take me to music in your poetry.
I mean, that is the line. That is, always what I'm working towards. I remember once I was in an airport queue and this guy said to me, "Oh, you write poetry, just chitter chatter." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "What kind?" And blah, 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 blah. And I said, "Well, I suppose I could put it like this. I don't write lyrics for songs, but what I'm trying to do is to write music with words, which is a little bit different. So not thinking about, lyrics that could go with music, but actually where the music itself resides in the language itself. I mean, that's why I like form. I mean, you have something like the sonnet Little Song. Is all in poetry. Poetry is, of all the forms, the most musical. So I didn't really learn an instrument as a child. I mean, it was funny. I'd learned piano at school, but we didn't have a piano. We had this knackered old harmonium that hardly worked. So anyway, I kind of gave up because I didn't, am I blaming the tools now? I kind of gave up because I only had harmonium. It should be oh yes, and then I became a concert pianist even though I only had a harmonium, but no, I just gave up. But anyway, music has shaped my life in many, many ways. As I sit here, I'm looking at my dad's vinyl, which I inherited. I can see Bob Andy and Marcia Griffiths, Young, Gifted and Black. I can see Shabba Ranks, that was mine. I can see Woman to Woman, Shirley Brown. That's just a sort of front of it. Like I said, my parents met in a jazz club. My mum was a massive, massive jazz fan throughout her life. I've made quite a lot of collaborations now, often with techno producers and electronica. The thing that interests me there is that idea around where the lyric is not a lyric. I was interested in the idea that actually the poetry became more another instrument rather than the song. So it's not sung, but it takes its place in a synthesis of different instruments in an arrangement. So I was kind of very interested in that. And then I'm interested in the sounds that nature might make as well. I've got this poem of trees and other fragments, and in that I collaborated with a friend who's a techno producer, Mars Sagnier, and with him he actually he got a sample of the sound that trees make when they're thirsty, then slowed it down, and then he put it into the tune, and then that's a kind of like a soundscape at the background. So I'm very interested in, and I also think that in aviary there's something about sound rather than what we see, but what we hear. And I feel sometimes that when you're in deep trauma, sound actually amplifies and becomes much bigger around you.
Yeah, I would send anyone listening to the poem Morbleu in An Aviary of Small Birds. When I read that, that was the most overwhelming tidal sonic experience. I got the sense of this is music, this is feeling. You've now moved into the novel, and you've produced and published a novel, Top Doll. The dolls in all of their variety, porcelain, rag, and so on, are in a hierarchy, which somehow kind of spookily mirrors the racial hierarchies of America or the global society constituted by the West.
It's a multi-narrator novel. So you've got two rag dolls, Miss Ting, who I'm actually going to describe.
Yes,
she's here.
We're reaching
on
up to her on the shelf.
And she is a Jamaican ragdoll. I bought her in Jamaica in 2018, and that's how she came to be in the novel. So that's what I mean. I tend to sort of like, sort of things happen in life and then they come along. And so I bought her for my niece, but then I wasn't quite able to give her to her because I thought she needs to stay with me so I can get the voice. So Miss Ting lives in this apartment in Park Avenue. It's very fancy with thousands of fancy antique dolls. One of those dolls is Dolly. Dolly really, she's a very entitled porcelain doll. She considers
a major character in this novel.
Yes.
Yes.
The first.
Well, the top of the pile.
She was, the Mammon, as she calls Huguette Clark, the billionaire with whom she spent her life. She's probably the favourite, the most important doll, the first doll, all of these things. She's half French for strange and obscure reasons I won't go into. And that is interesting that you sort of said about turning things up and down, because Dolly is half French, and I thought, well, I need to make up a language for her. It's kind of dollish. She speaks in sonnets, so they are these little songs. There's a sort of hysterical note to the book, which I like. And not in ha-ha, although some of it is funny, but in a kind of hysterical kind of way. And Dolly decides to sort of embark on telling the story of her and Maman and all of these things. But she does it in this voice, and I created this voice sort of using AI. Well, is Google Translate AI enough? I don't know.
They're in the same stable, aren't they?
Early AI, yeah. So I would write a line of one of these sonnets, and then I put it into Google translate it into the French that comes out of Google Translate, which I don't think, is that accurate.
Yeah, well.
Shall we say. Even, with my rudimentary grasp. Anyway, so then you put that into Google Translate and then get the French and then translate it back into English. Oh my God. What a wonderful mangling you got then.
My word.
And so I wanted to create this kind of grammatical sort of wrangling.
Yeah, it's a more complicated novel than I ever imagined.
Oh God, it is. Anyway, and so each line I kind of produced like that. And then, of course, I wrote them into sonnets, and then I created sonnet coronas. I mean, I wrote 10.
Which is sequences of sonnets.
Sequences of sonnets, yeah. So they have 14 sonnets, and then there are various rhyme schemes and repetitions throughout. But after a while, of course, I didn't really need the machine. I just needed it to get that grammatical kind of disruption. The Zuihitsu that ran through seasonal disturbances was disrupted. And then I've done a lot of disruption in terms of language, in terms of linear narrative. It's much more of a prismatic narrative in the novel.
Thank you. I think that's given listeners a very kind of a very, very clear insight into your relationship with nature, with place, with our society.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, Gabriel.
Karen McCarthy Woolf was in conversation with Gabriel Gbadamosi. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.